Hi guys, it's Zoe Russell. Welcome back to Offenders Walking Among Us, where we discuss a large range of true crime cases and uncover the psychology of it all as we take a deep dive into the DSM-5. This week we aim to prepare a forensic psychology autopsy report of the infamous and cannibalistic killer Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. But first, to review the facts of the case, we must start from the beginning. Jeffrey Dahmer, born on May 21st in 1960 to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Wisconsin. Lionel Dahmer was a graduate student studying analytical chemistry, while Joyce, previously a teletype machinist, is now a homemaker. Jeffrey was a product of a complicated pregnancy due to his mother suffering from protracted nausea, anxiety, and dysphoria, coupled with her use of prescribed tranquilizers. From early ages, Jeffrey had difficulties with appropriate eye-gaze behavior, a devoid of emotional glow, a certain motionless of his mouth, and a type of bodily awkwardness. The family tended to move houses and schools consistently. Despite this, he was described as a happy child who enjoyed family outings and going to the zoo, playing in the sandbox, and reading. By age 6, his father described him as a quiet boy who failed to initiate appropriate peer relationships as he felt more comfortable with routines and being alone. Although he was shy, he was not friendless. He attended Whittier School and spent time around the neighborhood with boys his age. They would explore animal research facilities and they would find themselves at abandoned houses. At age 6, Jeffrey was brought home by the police for throwing bricks through windows and engaging in these deviant activities. Jeffrey attended first grade at Hazel Harvey Elementary School in 1966. Teachers described him to be efficient with work and to have manners but lacked confidence and interest, making him appear unhappy. He befriended his neighbor Lee, and they often played together and went trick-or-treating. But Jeffrey continued to revert back to himself for his lack of trust. Following a move, Jeffrey then attended Bath Elementary School and stuck to his usual behaviors. This continued for the rest of development. The family moved to Iowa in September 1962 when Lionel began to study towards his Ph.D. at Iowa State University. The move to the new house did not seem to bother Jeffrey, who was content to sit in his room with his stuffed toy animals. Until age 15, when he rejected any interest in the world, his father attempted to introduce and noticed his fascination with bones, dead bodies, and bodily parts. Jeffrey was influenced towards these interests as his dad and him had previously bonded over chemistry and the nature of corrosive acids. Before this, Jeffrey shunned group activities and sports, even though his parents pressured him into social activities. He was once interested by a Boy Scout trip to New Mexico, although his efforts quickly diminished afterwards. Jeffrey's father appeared to display similarities within these behaviors. Jeffrey's father had developed obsessional patterns, except that his father's case involved a fascination with fire that later developed into an interest in bombs. Jeffrey began to gain more acquaintances, relocating to Eastview High School. Jeffrey and his friends created a game to ease their imagination called Infinity Land, which involved stickmen and spirals. The intent of the game was to refrain from contact with the other figures. If coming too close to one another, annihilation occurs. In 1974, Jeffrey went to Reverie High School. He played clarinet in the high school band his freshman year, played intramural tennis his sophomore year through senior years, and worked on the school newspaper, The Lantern, in his junior year. Though there was a switch in academic performance and he played many pranks, his teachers still described him to be intelligent. This was around the time that Jeffrey started drinking and doing drugs with fellow peers at 16, which began his motive to start acting out on his fantasies as he became near to contact with his first attraction. In several instances, he was seen drunk around the local Summit Mall, harassing patrons and pretending to have epileptic seizures. Since social media was not an innovative factor during this time period, his online presence was not as prevalent as compared to today's criminals. In his off time, he would direct himself to his obsessions. Many times he was found publicly masturbating and exposing himself to minors and adults while observing his subjects. Jeffrey had an obsession with a jogger who frequently ran past his house. Dahmer was attracted to the man's impressive physique but could not figure out how to meet him and feared that he would be rejected. 2 weeks after graduation, the first murder was committed. In June 1978, Jeffrey's attention was caught by a nearby male hitchhiker. He offered the man a ride with the convincing factors of marijuana and beer. The man felt uncomfortable and overstayed his welcome. Jeffrey noticed but wanted to keep him in the vicinity. The murder was acknowledged as unplanned by Jeffrey as he strangled him with the barbell he had previously hit him over the head with. He bought a hunting knife the following day to use and dispose of the body with. He found himself aroused during the dismemberment and sight of internal structures. At 3 a.m., he drove to dispense of the body but was stopped by a cop who let him free based on his friendly excuse. Dahmer then stashed the body at home for 2 years after. From this encounter, Jeffrey started using sleeping pills as the next step in his experiments to have total control over people without hurting them. In September of the same year, he was enrolled at Ohio State University to study business, although his stay there only lasted just short of a semester. In July of 1979, Jeffrey found interest in the Army and was shipped out to West Germany, where he put all of his skills towards being a medic. During his 2-year stay in the Army, he was also perceived as emotionally distant. As a homosexual adult, he was able to physically approach other males in gay bars, but wasn't able to form any close relationships. In March 1981, Dahmer was processed out of the Army. His parents were unsure of his whereabouts until about a month later when he contacted them from Miami. He worked at Sunshine Subs 7 days a week. He blew all of his money on what he thought was his antidote, alcohol, and was forced to move out of his house back to Ohio and live with his grandma, where he got a job at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center as a phlebotomist. As his work ethic decreased, he fell into a pattern of unemployment and the reliance of alcohol to escape his loneliness and inner torment. His grandmother ensured he would go to church and read the Bible. This helped to repress his sexual fantasies for the time being. Jeffrey also attended mandatory counseling but was uncooperative regarding family, alcohol, and arrest. He was unemployed for about 2 years before being hired at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company 6 days a week. This was around the time he began to kill again, and it has been 9 years since the initial accidental murder. However, a decisive difference between his childhood and early adolescence and his later life is the fact that he sexualized his fixated activity on the bodies and their parts, and they had an existential meaning with sexual satisfaction towards him. Jeffrey was essentially a cadaver collector. In November 1987, Jeffrey met Stephen Tuomi outside of Club 219, along with James Dockstader the following year in 1988. With both cases, he strangled and stored the body in the fruit cellar. The police could not link Jeffrey to Tuomi's murder, and Dockstader was not linked until after the arrest. Following his pattern of finding victims at bars and strangling them in their sleep, he met Richard Guerrero. Deterring from his MO, Jeffrey began to offer monetary proceeds for posing in the nude to get victims to his apartment. 13-year-old Somsak was the first, and luckily, somehow, Jeffrey just let him go. His parents took him to the emergency room, and his condition was explained by drugs and sexual exploitation. Jeffrey was arrested for this, along with second-degree sexual assault. Dahmer began preserving parts of his victims following this to reminisce his sexual gratification. Jeffrey met Anthony Sears at a bar and followed his original tactic to disable him. He took special interest in him particularly and preserved his genitals and head in acetone. In his apartment for the next 14 months, Dahmer killed 12 more times with the occasional new twist, including having sexual contact with the dead bodies and dismembered parts. While Dahmer lived and killed in the Oxford apartments, there were often complaints about noises at all hours and the nauseating smell coming from his apartment. One of the last few victims was the brother of a boy that Jeffrey had molested in 1988. He escaped in the nude after posing and being photographed and was discovered by 3 women who attempted to help him. One of the women dialed 911, but officers were blindsided by Jeffrey's ability to portray calmness and think quick on his feet under pressure. If you were holding your breath and you thought that was a close one, the very last victim, Edward Smith, was what led to the unraveling of Jeffrey's murder spree. Police officers were escorted by Edwards to Jeffrey's apartment, 213. He put on his charade and allowed the officers to enter. Despite the smell, nothing caught their eye, until the victim showed the officers the decapitated head of a male in the fridge he had previously seen, and a full criminal investigation commenced. Jeffrey was not cooperative with the arrest and told detectives Kennedy and Murphy that he had murdered 16 men in the previous 4 years. Once being interviewed and psychological assessments were given, the mental health diagnosis using the DSM-5 loosely states that he suffered from Asperger's disorder, although clinically he is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which can be identified with the code F60.2. Jeffrey is a primary example of people who suffer from the following diagnoses for the following. Jeffrey viewed male bodies not only as potential objects to promote order and constancy in his life, but also as avenues for sexual satisfaction, as evidenced by his relentless need to control, kill, dismember, and then engage in necrophilic sexuality. Regarding the Asperger's diagnosis, he was known to lack reciprocal social behavior, a situation that closely linked to his inability to make close friendships with his peers. He also aimed to force people to become his pawns in his game for his own enjoyment on his own terms. His unusual rigid body kinetics have been evident since early childhood, and he has obsessive and compulsive interest in animals and in later life human bodies and their component parts. Other characteristics of this diagnosis can cause impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Regarding the antisocial personality disorder, Jeffrey displayed the following: failure to conform to social norms and respecting laws which are placed on grounds for arrest. He repeatedly conned his victims into thinking they were getting something in return for his own personal benefit. He's very impulsive due to his irritability, causing him to become reckless when drinking. He also did not have remorse in the typical way, but it was as he felt attached to their parts and he wanted to preserve them and their memories and let his fantasy live on. It also stated that his loneliness could have been a factor that put him at risk for these antisocial behaviors when comorbid with other factors such as substance abuse, depression, social emotional incapacities, lack of social support and guidance, or an indifferent environment, and a lack of self-esteem. Bail was set at $5 million, and he was convicted of 2 counts of murder for the deaths of James Joxeter and Richard Guerrero, and 1 count of intentional homicide for the death of Edward Smith. Thus, Jeffrey was charged with 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin, 1 count of murder in Ohio. He was not charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards, nor was he charged with the death of Stephen Tiomi. Jeffrey used an insanity plea, although he pleaded guilty. The 7 experts who assessed and testified could not come to an agreeable conclusion regarding Jeffrey's mental stability. Jeffrey was sentenced to 957 years in prison, but he only served less than 3. At about 8:10 a.m., Jeffrey was found on the floor of the staff bathroom covered in blood with severe head injuries due to the aggressive acts of a fellow prisoner. He died en route to the Divine Savior Hospital. Ultimately, the sentence reflected the severity and extent of his crimes, which can be supported through Jeffrey's attorney and myself. In my opinion, I think his behavior worsened due to the fact that his family moved around a lot, and from this, he struggled to make friends that continued to engage him. A lot also has to deal with the nature and nurture he experienced as a child, dealing with parents who have an unhappy marriage and later ended up in a divorce. I think he tended to overcompensate for the loss or voids these factors gave him and found that within his obsessions. It's not that he didn't attempt therapy or other avenues. I think he was just too comfortable with his oddities. If law enforcement had acknowledged several of his arrests beforehand, kept track of records or several of the signs, meaning going further into questioning, each time he had a run out with the law, they could have saved many more lives. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time.